Thanks, Miriam.
Take your shirt off.
No, don't.
So I'm about to take us... We're about to go on a journey. Isn't that how... So I believe David said this last year before his talk. He said, just settle back and enjoy the image that I'm trying to paint for you today. There aren't any jokes.
Oh.
Just have a read of that. Thank you,
From
Raylan.
Avengers?
It is from Paradise Lost, which would be the way that I would describe Avengers Endgame.
Any spoilers.
First there was chaos, the vast immeasurable abyss, outrageous as a sea, dark, wasteful and wild.
Story of your life.
So in the beginning there was chaos. For the Greeks, this may have been a powerful primordial deity alone and reigning over an empty void. Or it may have been simply a state of confusion and meaninglessness, something akin to our modern scientific understanding of the state of things before the Big Bang. The Greek poet Hesiod described how gods came from nothing, and the American physicist Lawrence Krauss explains how the god particle came from nothing as well.
You get it, you can breathe.
Do you know, as I wrote this, I knew you were going to say that, and I'll probably cop it another 5 times during this talk, or more. History is a seamless cloth, a flowing tapestry that carries narrative across time's rough stitching. There's a tapestry that hangs in the National Gallery called the Crimson Thread of Kinship. On it, a single red cord flows through Australia's history, tying our past to the present and to the future.
We know how you feel.
Where past and future collide, we exist right now. Impossibly, because how can you measure the present? Do you say 2019? Do we say April? Do we say the 27th, this second, this nanosecond? Imagine how tiny we are, a speck on a rock hurtling around a tiny sun in a galaxy of billions, in a cluster of billions more, a fragment of matter fleeting for a second in a vast, indifferent universe. And even that is more persistent than each moment that we call the present. Time flies and it flees from us irretrievably. Historian Martin Ball argued that history's cloth is pleated, while the seamless fabric...
Super dirty.
I was like Googling like vagina flowers, but... While the seamless...
That was the first time.
I mean, like it came up in my history, but... While the seamless fabric rolls on, it folds on itself, echoing things that have happened before. History repeats itself. So let me take you through the key moments in history that have brought us to this moment.
This moment?
In the beginning, there was chaos.
I wish they had privately.
The penises have been tastefully cropped off the photo.
No, they're askew. Oh,
There's one going into Dave's ear.
Whether we understand that as an empty void, or perhaps as some supernatural savage that predates the known universe, curiously, most societies will have a narrative about humanity's fall from grace. We're all pretty familiar with the story of Adam and Eve. God decided to create first the universe, and then just 2 boring humans, and then planted a tree in the Garden of Eden, the fruit of which they were prohibited. The only prohibition at that point in the history of time. Obviously, this precedes the New South Wales Liberal government. And of course, from here we know the story. Eve slinks off and is tempted by the snake, Satan in disguise, if you ask Milton. She takes a bite, the rush of wisdom and desire overpowers her, and she convinces Adam to do the same.
women.
From the outset, it's clear why the conservative dogma of the church has sustained sexism to this very day. Eve's lapse was just the first in a series of human failures, and whenever you ask a certain type of man, it's always the fault of women. Cleopatra tempted Caesar. Lady Macbeth tempted her husband. Julia Gillard tempted us all with childless atheism. And Black Widow Black Widow caused Hulk's erectile dysfunction. Of course, this interpretation is pretty unfair. The Greeks, perhaps, had a better idea of it. Greedy male gods spent their times eating and raping their way through the universe. Uranus, raping their way through the universe. Uranus, or Uranus, more appropriate, was cruel and capricious, so he was gelded by his son Cronus, the departed member splashing into the ocean and giving immaculate birth to the goddess Aphrodite. Cronus took after his, history, but Cronus took after his father and also was a real cunt, so he started to eat his children. He was overthrown by his youngest son, Zeus. And the war between...
He's been on real memes for harvesting.
I had to do a fair bit of harvesting there. I did a bit of harvesting. The war between the Olympians, led by Zeus, and the Titans, with a couple of notable traitors like the Titan Prometheus, who was a close friend and ally of Zeus, was recorded by Hesiod and Apollonius of Rhodes in the Great Library of Alexandria. These myths and narratives are with us all thanks in part to the Great Library of Alexandria, one of the first libraries in the world. And the tale of mankind's enlightenment isn't one of our fall, but the fall of Prometheus. He created us out of clay. He gave us fire, knowledge, and wisdom, and in exchange, Zeus sentenced him to eternity, having his liver pecked out by an eagle. Why would Zeus punish him for this? Why do the gods worry so much about humans having access to wisdom and knowledge? I suppose in part it's because it set in train the stories of hubris and arrogance that characterise people. There's a long line of stories, a kind of prehistory of myth that leads to the Greek invasion of a city in the west of modern Turkey, known as Ilium. The story of that invasion told by Homer is called the Iliad, and we know that city today as Troy, buried under layers and layers of history. It's one of those incredibly rare moments in history where Europeans invaded lands owned by other people.
Conspiracy theory!
The story of the Trojan War is a familiar one. Soak it up for a moment. It's a complex meme.
Soak it up like the underwear.
That's right, yeah.
Like
Bit of post-urinal dribble. The story of the Trojan War is a familiar one. All cheating spouses and starting wars. There's a wooden horse. What's really interesting about the story of Troy, though, is what happens when the war ends. The Greeks sack the city and all of our heroes get on their way. You've probably all heard the story of the Odyssey in one form or another. Cunning Odysseus gets lost on a 10-year journey across the Mediterranean. He ends up spending a few years with a witch named Circe and a nymph named Calypso before leaving both and breaking their hearts. He takes a trip to the underworld to touch base with heroes past and present, to get in contact with Aesir to see what he should do. And Odysseus is driven to return to his home, his island kingdom of Ithaca, which calls him back. Robert Biddlestone, in his book Odysseus Unbound, which researches the historicity, thank you Luke, this is a real word, historicity of the Odyssey, he uses geological surveys cross-referenced with passages from Homer to identify the place where Odysseus' palace may have stood, and he writes, "Sometimes the spirit tells us what the intellect cannot. This is a view that defies description and resists photography." I mean, apparently it doesn't resist it too strongly.
Underwater in 2 years.
To see it once, yeah. To see it once is to realise that you could never walk away to make your home on a lower contour. To awaken here at the start of each day is to experience a sensation so sublime that it renders you immortal. On this hilltop you'll sup at the table of the gods. A palace built here is a passport to Olympus. From this summit you will plan the takeover of Troy. From these mountains you will fell the trees for your galleys. From this harbour you will sail with your fleet to rescue Helen. On this hilltop you are truly Odysseus, and however far you travel, you will always return. On the other side of the war, of course, were the Trojans. And after they were thoroughly routed, a pile of them fled the city as refugees. The most famous of these, Jenny is a fan, a man named Aeneas. Aeneas, sure. Aeneas left Troy after the war and went on a long journey across the Mediterranean. His crew of bros brought him to a city in North Africa called Carthage, where he boned its queen, Dido. Realising that he had a greater mission, Aeneas abandoned the love-struck Dido, who eventually killed herself. Aeneas was on his way to found the great civilization in Rome, and he takes a trip to the underworld to touch base with heroes past and present, and to get in contact with a seer to see what he needed to do. He founds the holy city, and Rome and Carthage, so the myth goes, hated each other ever since. At least until Rome burned old Carthage at the end of the Punic Wars and rebuilt the city.
Where's Carthage?
I'll bring up a map in a moment. A very rare instance of Europeans invading a land owned by other people.
Very rare.
Very rare. Fun fact, Caesar himself, the Roman ruler who once burned the Great Library, was mythologized by Virgil as being descended from Aeneas. Virgil wrote the Aeneid during the Augustan period when Caesar's adopted son Octavian, I feel so scared wandering into Roman history with Jenny sitting in the audience. When his son Octavian...
Oh, your face, Jenny.
Imperious face. How would you feel scared?
Don't be intimidated.
had taken his father's mantle as Emperor Caesar Augustus. So really, Augustus was also descended in a way from Aeneas, a prince of Troy, cousin of King Priam, descendant of the Greek goddess Aphrodite. Of course, it was during Augustus's reign that another prince was born, also the son of a god, or the god, depending who you talk to, a Jew named Jesus. He was born in Bethlehem, a town in the West Bank, then occupied by the superior might of Rome. While we divide history into BC and AD based on the date around his supposed birth, I mean, like he existed, he was born there, but was he actually born around that time? Fake news, potentially. There are some theories that the Star of Bethlehem that was recorded in the sky above that is actually Halley's Comet,
Pat's obsessed with Halley's Comet.
which appeared in the year 12 BC, according to notes taken by the Chinese during before they all enrolled at Sydney University in their business degrees.
Say during the Hunger Games.
during the Han Dynasty, but that's probably too much of a stretch. Time, like fabric, can be made to bend.
Again, really don't think Pat's ever seen a vagina.
To bend, to pleat, maybe even to tear, but not to break. About 400 years after Jesus was crucified and the Roman Empire was stuck halfway between the old gods and the new, there lived a man named Saint Augustine of Hippo, who spent his life stuck between the old gods and the new Christian God.
What the fuck is he holding?
In his
Stannis Baratheon.
in his Confessions, Saint Augustine reflects on time. How is it possible, he asked, for us to exist on a single point of time, running from one to the next? I know well enough what it is, he said, provided that nobody asks me. And whenever someone would ask him, what was God doing before he made heaven and earth? Augustine would reply, he was preparing hell for people who ask into mysteries. Actually, if you ask a figure like Lyle Shelton today, he'd probably say God was preparing hell for people like Augustine. Augustine grew up in North Africa, and like so many Romans at the time, you'd actually be surprised how the last 100 years have whitewashed the founding fathers of Western civilization. Whiteness invades our perceptions of the past.
Actually, that picture of me before I showed my beard.
Which one?
Obviously, I'm right.
That's no, it's not purple enough, Jenny, for you in middle of summer. Augustine ended up studying in a city called Carthage, where he and his crew at the time were known for being slutty bros who boasted about their sexual conquest.
Sorry, you're fucking lying.
And also for scandalously stealing fruit off their neighbours' trees. Augustine did fall in love with a woman, though, while he was in Carthage, but he abandoned her because he was on a greater mission, a spiritual mission that would take him to Rome.
Did she kill herself?
We're not quite sure, but I assume she did. Because it works for my speech. Fast forward now to the year 1066, and a group of Frenchmen known as the... I skipped over a solid 700 years. I said fast forward.
When the Dark Ages happened, Pat. Jenny, you said fast forward.
I said fast forward. Fuck give me a break. I also was like, I need to get into the era of history where Jenny gets less confident. Fast forward now to the year 1066, and a group of Frenchmen known as the Normans, led by William the Conqueror, led by William the Conqueror, incidentally the name of the first Norman to arrive in Australia on the Third Fleet, defeated King Harold of England at the Battle of Hastings. The invasion had been portended by the arrival of Halley's Comet, which is recorded in the Bayeux Tapestry. You can actually see it up here on the top of that tapestry, another wonderful tapestry recording King Harold of England, who I literally just mentioned. Another tapestry recording that crimson thread or the bright blue light of a comet that streaks across our history. This wasn't the only conquering that was going on over the next 100 or so years. 200 or so years, the Catholic Church called a number of crusades and Europeans invaded lands owned by other people, this time extending down through a region of what is now modern Turkey. By this stage, the Roman Catholic faith had spread out across Europe, and its humble home in Italy gave rise to one of the great poetic epics, Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. It's the story of a poet who decides to take a journey into the underworld. Guided by a Roman poet named Virgil. Literature is, above all else, completely unoriginal. At least Dante sets out not to consult with seers or found cities, but just seems to be lost in a forest with nowhere better to go than hell. Just like all of us, who does Dante find in the depths of hell? Well, obviously old mate Satan, who was cast back there for tempting Eve, and Satan now spends his days encased in ice, gnawing on the heads of history's three great traitors. Judas, who betrayed Jesus to the Romans, and the Romans Cassius and Brutus, who betrayed Caesar. The descendant of Aeneas, who was written about by Virgil, who led Dante into the underworld.
Excellent! This is so good.
During the Renaissance... During the Renaissance, literature flourished. In many instances inspired by Dante and Shakespeare himself, writing his highly original plays, Troilus and Cressida, which tells the story of a Trojan prince who falls in love and is taken prisoner during the war in Greece, Julius Caesar, which tells the story of a Roman hero lied to by his friends Cassius and Brutus, assassinated in the Ides of March, Antony and Cleopatra, which acts as a sequel to Julius Caesar, as Caesar's best friend and ex-girlfriend team up to try and defeat his heir. And in Lear, he wrote about fallen kings and descent into madness, and in Macbeth, he writes about conniving wives and political assassinations.
Get it? You can read.
No spoilers.
In Hamlet... In Hamlet, he writes about the endless circling around action. The trouble of life is that things seem to happen, but nothing is ever new. We're here again a year later. We are paralysed by inaction, by repetition. To be or not to be, or to be again and again and again. Around the same time in France, historians began revising their own history. The Holy Roman Empire, the League of Catholic Germanic states that came to succeed the western part of the Roman Empire, surrounded and dominated the politics of Europe. As Rome, both in its Byzantine configuration in Constantinople, which these days is known as Istanbul, an area in the west of modern Turkey, and in its Italian origin, which Rome receded, and the Franks began to mythologize a founding figure, King Francus, a refugee who travelled up the Dardanelles, the son of a man named Priam, whose city on the west coast of modern Turkey was besieged by Greece some 2,000 years prior. 7 centuries after France invaded England in 1066, I'm skipping ahead another 700 years, England decided to invade Australia in a rare instance of Europeans invading lands owned by other people. 1788 marked another instance of, as Karl Marx described it 70-odd years later, history repeating itself. The first time as tragedy and every time after a never-ending farce. In 1835, 2 years after Halley's Comet hurtled past the Earth, Mark Twain was born. Twain was a wonderful writer, and probably his wittiest book is The Innocents Abroad. He was offered a ticket. Oh, we get it, Viv! You read a book! He was offered a ticket to go on a cruise around America to the Old World, and he ended up visiting places like France and Rome and Israel, an area in the west of modern Turkey. In 1910, only a few years after the sinking of the Titanic, and before the end of the Old World and the arrival of the new...
That's about 5.3.
Yeah, it's about 5 point... and before the end of the Old World and the arrival of the new, Halley's Comet swung through the sky again, this time closer and brighter than ever. Mark Twain wrote in his autobiography, anticipating the return of the comet, "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It is coming again next year and I expect to go out with it. It will be the greatest disappointment of my life if I don't go out with Halley's Comet. The Almighty has said, no doubt, now here are these two unaccountable freaks. They came in together and they must go out together." He died on the 21st of April 1910, the day after Halley's Comet came again. A few years later, Australia went to war alongside England, a united federation of states, united by what founding father Henry Parkes called the Crimson Thread of Kinship. The Gallipoli campaign is burned into Australian myth, our nation's baptism of fire, and a rare occasion on which Europeans invaded lands owned by another people. This time, England and Australia attacked a small area in the west of what is now modern Turkey. A passage of water called the Dardanelles. It's only an hour or so north of the ruins of a city called Troy. Writing about this historic moment and the way it echoes England's invasion of Australia back in 1788, historian Martin Ball explained the history as pleated. The imagery feels the same. Boats arrive on a coast far from home to take the land... to take the land from its owners. Time, Albert Einstein said, is relative. Not in a purely metaphorical sense, but literally. Gravity affects time. Gravity affects time. The speed at which a person travels affects time. We stand on a point of time, but that time stretches and bends relative to the time experienced by another. History itself doesn't just repeat and pleat, it pauses and warps. It accelerates during war and it stands still when we're in love. The 20th century was filled with wars, so many wars, and so many of them centred around the oil-rich lands to the east of what is now known as modern Turkey. Or to the west in the old fractured remains of empires, all descended from that foundational war in Troy. Priam's children struck out again and again and again, 1,000 times the retribution for Prometheus's reckless folly. On the 10th of February in 1986...
Skip forward to Owen's talk.
Yeah, that's why I put Owen's talk after mine. But on the 10th of February 1986, Halley's Comet could be seen soaring above Australia. And at the same time as that fiery star burned in the skies over Gosford, a child was born to Norman parents. Stranger things take place in the 1980s, but none, for my mind, was stranger than this.
I'm so glad Owen got to make his speech.
Imagine growing up in a country like Australia, where the oldest culture on the earth exists beside, displaced, deprecated but not destroyed by the warlike Western tradition, reaching back to chaos via England, via France, via Rome, via Carthage, via Troy, via Greece, Odysseus, and Aphrodite. Maybe that connection to chaos explains the last 10 years of Australian politics. Every king down by the knife, Lear, Hamlet, Macbeth rolled into one. Malcolm Turnbull described a certain madness, and killing the king who rules by divine right from a temple on Olympus or in Point Piper is a grievous crime against nature that drove King Lear into madness. Likewise, the stabbing of a Caesar like Turnbull still shocks us when it happens, even though it's an old story. The whole world is put out of joint. Australia has hosted a great deal of dramatic news over the past year or so. It's as though our history has accelerated with each political knifing. The fall from grace is an Australian pastime, whether it's someone who is booted out of the country for claiming that Islam is the most feminist religion, or someone who is dragged back from a spiritual mission in Rome for tasting a fruit that should genuinely be forbidden. It's almost as though we exist out of joint and out of time. Cavemen in suits romp the landscape here. 200 years after white men arrived and decimated the first Australians. He's beetroot purple. What is it? That fucked up. That's.
Go back to England, man.
That's our facially disconfigured former Deputy Prime Minister. 200 years after white men arrived and decimated the first Australians, and it's as though we're regressed into something prehistoric. Prehensile, even. The Great Library of Alexandria... Oh, here we go. Sorry, this was in The Guardian, the Sydney Morning Herald several moments ago. Plants are dying, businesses are hurting, but Barnaby Joyce is still the favourite in New England. Truly, we are prehensile in Australia. The Great Library of Alexandria burned thousands of years ago. But the barbarians still roam the streets of Warringah, shocked to see that something of those stories survived. So much for Western civilization. A few years back, Clive James translated Dante's Divine Comedy. A feat the great Australian poet and writer described as his life's work. In writing about his life in the book Unreliable Memoirs, James penned some beautiful words about Sydney Harbour and what it was like for him to pack up and leave the land that birthed him to set sail for distant Europe. As I begin this last paragraph, outside my window a misty afternoon drizzle gently but inexorably soaks the city of London. Down there in the street I can see umbrellas commiserating each other. In Sydney Harbour, 12,000 miles away and 10 hours from now, the yachts will be racing on the crushed diamond water under a sky the texture of powdered sapphires. It would be churlish. Cobalt sapphires. It would be churlish not to concede that the same abundance of natural blessings which gave us the energy to leave has every right to call us back. All in the whip is taken. Pulsing like a beacon through the days and nights, the birthplace of the fortunate sends out its invisible waves of recollection. It always has, and it always will, until even the last of us come home.
Jesus shit.
The other day, as I walked through Redfern, I came across a crow eating the rotten corpse of a magpie. As the crow glanced up from its morbid breakfast, it glared at me, a furious challenge, daring me to tuck into the decay.
So it's Becky.
Perhaps it recognised in me a kindred spirit. Two creatures trapped in feathers on a rock hurtling through the darkness. Each of us bound for the same station in life and death as that hapless magpie. So here we are. At the end of this story, told to you today by me, a great librarian, a prince of Gosford, who has journeyed to Rome and will soon journey to an area in the west of modern Turkey, and a city called Jerusalem, and to an island called Ithaca. A Norman, born under a bright shooting star, rarely seen twice in a lifetime. A star that will return on the 28th of July in 2061, and I'll probably go out with it. Two unaccountable freaks. History repeats itself until it doesn't. The scintillating beacon calls us home until it stops. And we are trapped in infinite regress until the cycle is broken.
Then it's all just a little bit of history repeating.